Greetings, family. Kevin Baker here, Baker Consulting, coming to you, wanting to just kind of talk about some things that's hitting the airways and the media these days, right? I've kind of titled this The Opportunity um, as we move forward. There's been a lot of controversy and things about the subject of DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, over the past few years and the past few months and weeks, right? As we know that these things have been under attack. Also, understanding that DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, is an offshoot of the Civil Rights Act, right? That prevents discrimination. That's kind of what it rolls out of. Now, the things I'm gonna just mention here, I'm just gonna touch down on them and go back up, right? Because each segment of it requires a lot of in-depth thinking. So here I'm gonna give a broad overview, and then over the next coming weeks, I will add into what I am saying, or go into more descriptive or description of the elements here that I'm talking about, that's kind of gotten us here, and and then thinking about where do we go from here, right? So in thinking about DEI and what's happening, there's a lot to consider. First, going back historically and looking at segregation and integration, right? Because the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a big step in integration. A few things happened right after that, right? We began to see the prison industrial complex rise in the 70s, and then in the 80s, we saw trades, arts, music, these soft and hard skills that were learned at the high school level being taken out of schools, especially urban schools. Not all schools, right? Private schools, it still stayed there. And then just depending on where the school was located in urban areas. Generally, if it was more white, then these subjects stayed, but if it wasn't, then they would disappear. Of course, that was all said to be a part of the funding issues that was coming up around school, because we know that school funding is set up in an institutional, racist way, that the higher the property values, the more funding a particular school may get, right? So just recognizing the inherent inequity in that, right? Also, this thing came about where we started calling it college preparedness, right? So let's everybody go to college, right? And that's the thing. So here today we have so many folks that, so when we think about now the fact that there are, I believe that, and don't quote me on these statistics, but I know I've heard it, right, that black women are likely the most educated in this society, and we know that black men is the largest demographic of folks that's locked up, right, in the prison industrial complex. Now, that's not to say that there aren't educated black men, and that there aren't some black women who are locked up. We know that both are true, right? So when we think about this, we also think about the fact that when we think about welfare, right? Generally, when people talk about welfare, the image that comes into people's minds is black people. Yet we know that there are more white people on welfare than black people. The other thing, and we know that that DEI, like welfare, carries that same imagery, right? So when we hear people talk about DEI, generally we think about black people. right? It's this meta communication where these things become synonymous in us understanding. So you say something and you get this image, right? That's been really key in the whole anti-blackness thing, that and the inhumanity that has gone on in this society, in an effort to keep race in the forefront of so many minds, or as an excuse to drum roll or to motivate poor white people into action, right? So what else around this? So when we think about DEI as the face of black people, yet white women have benefited the most from DEI efforts, right? So understanding the meta communication that happens there, that why this other group has been the most benefited, when we think about it, it's this quote unquote minority group that's thought about, right? That's on purpose. So all of this really continues to feed the inhumanity that comes up in this society towards black people. And we have to ask ourselves why, right? So when we think about and talk about all of these areas and isms that's there, I have maintained, as some others, that race is at the root of it. Now, when we think about the 45 to 60% of white folks that voted in this past election, we know that their vote was synonymous with one thing, and that was whiteness, and to keep whiteness in play. That's not surprising, right? We could see that. We could see that with Project 2025, all of that. And even this thing where we have heard people talk about the fact that, white men have been feeling discriminated against, and, make the country great again, which, when we look at when was it great, right? We know for certain groups it was, but for others it has not been, right? Also, it is refreshing to know that probably 37 to 50% of white people, did say, hey, we need a change. We want to do something differently. That was encouraging. Right, and also understanding that there are some black folks and some Latinos who also voted against their best interests, right? And we could chalk this up to cultural conditioning and internalized oppression and all of these things, which are big topics that require so much more discussion, right? If you don't know what I'm talking about when I talk about it was a vote for whiteness, then basically what I am referring to is the invisibility of institutional privilege that exists and is often unacknowledged by those who voted for the current administration, as well as some who didn't vote for it, right? There's still this invisibility there of this institutional privilege and power of this thing called whiteness. There's a plane going overhead, so let's let it go. Okay, so there's still this unacknowledged institutional privilege of whiteness that is here, that exists in this country, that we have to acknowledge, especially with us wanting to get to our full humanity, right? One of the things that I have often heard when having conversations with different racial groups is that we're all human. And we may say that on the surface level, but ultimately my belief is that being human is a maturation process. Just because we are born doesn't mean that we're human, because there are so many of us that still act in animalistic ways, right? And we have to begin to deal with this and talk about this. In my work, my effort has been to help people do their personal work to grow their humanity. right? Because in all of us growing our humanity, we get to this point of being able to do we must do our personal work in order to get there, right? And that's often what people don't want to do. You know, we have this belief that we're all perfect and we don't need to do any personal work. But yes, human development is necessary, and it is something that we need to do overall, right? And that's what my efforts and work has been, and doing organizational culture change has been, right? Is how do we unearth all of the elements around culture that impacts how we work together and how we be together, right? And this is something that we have to do in order to get to our humanity. This other noise in the background that y'all may hear is rain, because I'm sitting out in the rain, right? I love sitting in the rain. Don't y'all love sitting in the rain? So anyway, there will be more to come on these topics, and I'll talk more about it and go in depth in different areas, because there was a path that we took to get here. And ultimately, we all are going to have to work together to create this path out of this, right? How do we unite? How do we understand cultural conditioning that got us in the situation that we're in? And how do we join and find each other who want to get to this shared humanity? How do we do that? That's a question. Send me your thoughts and comments, and I will continue to post as I work on these articles. Also, go to my website, thebakerconsulting.com. Again, that's thebakerconsulting.com. Check out my blogs. I'll be putting this up eventually as I continue to write through it. Thank you so much.